In this video, we'll be looking at some filling stitches so that you can fill in some areas of your design and give it some texture. We'll be using some French knots, seeding and satin stitch. So here I'm going to place some French knots in this shape. Now you can either outline the shape first, or you can put the French knots in a solid cluster to cover up. You can do your casting on the outside edge if you're going to put an outline, but if you're not going to put an outline and you just want some spaced out French knots, the casting on is slightly different. So you would cast on underneath where you want your French knots to be, and then cover up each of the cast on back stitches with a particular French knot, so they can be each covered up individually. So I've put my casting on there. I'm going to come up next to the casting on stitch. So creating the French knot, you hold the thread with some tension coming up from the surface. Lay the needle on the thread and wrap around once. If you use your finger to hold the knot in place while you put the needle into the fabric, and don't go in the same hole, go very close by but not quite in the same hole with your needle. At this stage, let go of the thread and pull until the thread is tight around the needle, and then slide the thread to the bottom of the needle. This gives you complete control over your French knot, but keep the tension in the loose piece here. As you pull the needle through, just guide the thread into position to stop it getting knotted on the way. And there is your French knot. So for the second one, we're going to come up next to the casting on place. Hold the thread tight, place the needle on and wrap around. Steady that with your finger. Position the needle into the fabric and then pull the thread and slide into position. Hold on to the thread and guide it into the knot to complete. That's your French knot. So you can use French knots spaced out with gaps in between, or you can cluster them very tightly together to create a lumpy texture to fill in a shape. So these can be used as tiny accents or clusters of texture. They can be all in one colour, or they could be many different colours. We have an example of French knots being used for hair. Could be used for tight curls. Could also be used in a similar way that you would use pointillism, using small dots of colour. For this section of the letter, I'm going to use seeding to decorate the inside of this curve. So I've cast on my thread on the outside line, ready to be covered over by some more of the orange stem stitch. And we're just going to use small straight stitches for seeding. The trick to this is to make sure that no two stitches are the same angle. So you're using varied directions to sprinkle the stitches on the surface, a bit like hundreds and thousands, where you're just sprinkling the stitches randomly in all angles. So for my little light bulb here, I want to do a solid stitch. So I'm going to use Satin Stitch to completely cover the shape itself. So I'm going to fill it in completely. This is what we call a closed filling stitch, where none of the fabric is showing through. So I'll start with my knot inside the line, inside the shape, and create my casting on inside my shape, which will be covered over by the closed filling stitch, the satin stitch. So when you're using satin stitch or anything that has an important angle, you always start from the center of the shape. So coming up on one side of the shape and going across the shape itself. You can use your thread like a plumb line to set the angle that you want for your satin stitch. So I'm using it going straight across. You could have it at a diagonal angle or a vertical or horizontal angle. With satin stitch, you come up on the same side each time with a long stitch on the back and go backwards and forwards over the shape from the back to the front. So for the little filament inside the light bulb here, I'm going to use a fly stitch. There are two types of fly stitch. One is a Y shape and one is a V shape. I'm going to use the Y shape version here just to create my little filament inside my light bulb. So you're coming up at the top of the Y shape on one side and going down on the Y shape on the other side, holding a loop on the surface. Then come up in the bottom of the triangle part of the Y, and as you pull tight, this creates the V shape. The length of stitch determines whether it's a V or a Y. If you go straight over the edge of the loop, it becomes a V shape. If you do a slightly longer stitch, it becomes a Y shape. Also with this section, I'm just going to demonstrate straight stitch, which is, as it sounds, just a singular straight stitch to create small textures. You might want these on individual eyelashes or eyebrows, or just areas where you want a straight line that's more deliberate than the random seed stitch. If you wanted to do your fly stitch in a V shape, I'll just demonstrate that here for you. So again, exactly the same as the Y, you're coming up at the top and going down at the top of the V shape, holding the loop on the surface, then come up at the bottom of the triangle, pull tight and stitch directly over the loop. This will give you your small V shape. These can be used very close together to create a closed filling stitch, or can be used with gaps in either the V or the Y shape. We love seeing all the projects, so please ask your school to share images of the work with us on social media. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter at Royal Needlework and use the hashtag RSN Selfie. Here is the finished piece. We hope that it's inspired you too.